chapter 13, the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, if you think back to lab last week, we talked about that there's 4 main regions of the brain. So we have the cerebrum, which is kind of the outer big part on the top. Then inside we have the diencephalon, which is the deeper areas of the brain. The cerebellum is the little tiny piece on the back, and then we have the brain stem, which connects down to the spinal cord. So today we're talking about the cerebrum, and it is going to be where all of our complex intellectual functions happen, our thought, planning, personality, anything that we're conscious of. So if we are conscious of a sense or if we're voluntarily initiating a movement, it's got to go through that cerebrum. It has 2 large hemispheres on the superior aspect of the brain. So the top, we have 2 large hemispheres, a left and a right. And they're connected by something called the longitudinal, or actually divided by something called the longitudinal fissure. And this is like a really large, very, very deep sulcus. And it's going to divide your brain into these 2 halves, so a right and left hemisphere. And if we look, there should be a picture here. This right here is going to be your longitudinal fissure. So it's dividing it into a left hemisphere on this side and a right hemisphere on the other side. So these are fairly separate, but we do have some white matter tracks that are going to be connecting these 2. And remember that white matter is made of myelinated axons, whereas the gray matter is made of cell bodies, dendrites, things like that. So that white matter is made of myelinated axons, and it's going to be these axons running from one side to the next. And the biggest tract that you definitely need to know is the corpus callosum. And so this is going to be identified in the lab last week. It's the white matter tract that connects the right and the left hemispheres of the brain. So as we talk about the brain, we're going to be looking at all these different lobes and these different regions, and we're going to sort of say that we have this lobe does this thing and this region does this thing, and they're kind of specialized, but it's a little bit of an oversimplification. A lot of these regions are going to exhibit multiple functions, and some functions are not easily assigned to one region. They're still doing a lot of studies about exactly which parts of the brain are controlling which, senses or which part of reasoning. There's also a lot of study that has been shown that if you have damage to one area of the brain, and so you lose some sort of function, other areas of the brain can kind of pick up and compensate and learn to do, that type of processing. So there is some plasticity, there is neuroplasticity, so your brain can compensate for some types of damage. So we're going to be sort of chunking up the brain into these different parts and say this region mostly does this, this region mostly does this, this region mostly does this. But know that these are a little bit oversimplified, and the brain is very complex, and all these pieces of the brain work together. The next thing to remember is that connections within the body are generally crossed. So generally, if we have the left side of our brain here, it's going to be controlling as well as sensing things from the right side of our body. And the right side of their brain is going to be controlling and sensing things from the left side of our body. Some higher order functions exhibit what we call lateralization. And I'll talk about this in a couple slides. And that means that one side of the brain, like the left side of the brain, might have a little bit more to do with like language comprehension, and the right side of the brain has a little bit more to do with like spatial relationships. And so we say that one side sort of primarily controls one thing, but know that they still work together. So we identified the different lobes in lab, but just as a review, this is the anterior surface, and so this is the frontal lobe. Then next, this is the central sulcus. And so this first gyrus right in front of that is called the precentral gyrus, and that's important. We'll talk about why it's important. Then right below here, we have the parietal lobe. So this pink part here, and this first gyrus here right after the central sulcus is called the postcentral gyrus, and that one's important too, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. Now in the back, we can see this is the occipital lobe, and then we can't see it from this view, but underneath here, like in this area is where the temporal lobe would be, and then the insular lobe is kind of deep. So there's 2 other lobes that we can't see from this view. So your lobes of the cerebrum, as I said, I'm going to kind of assign these are like basic general functions. So these are the ones to learn first, and we'll talk a little bit more as we go about more specific things they do, but the general functions that you definitely need to make sure you remember on this slide. So your frontal lobe has to do with motor functions, free will, decision-making, planning, and personality. Your parietal lobe has to do with general body sensation. And so these general senses include touch, temperature, and pain. So we can feel things all over our skin. Our occipital lobe in the back is going to be important for receiving the sense associated with vision. So all of our visual information goes to our occipital lobe. The temporal lobe has to do with two different senses, and the temporal lobe is going to receive stimuli that has to do with hearing as well as smell. So both of these are kind of on the side of your face, so you can kind of think the temporal lobe is on the side. And then finally, the insula, which is that deep lobe, has to do with taste. So this is just like a really good, very bullet point. Here are some functions of the lobes. You definitely need to remember those. So as we look through, and sorry, this is not the best resolution, but hopefully you can see it fairly well. Your book has a good one so you can look at. These are the different lobes of the brain and their functional areas. So here is the frontal lobe here, and you can see it's got a bunch of different important areas, and we'll talk about them each individually. This is the lateral sulcus. So the lateral sulcus divides the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and a little bit of the parietal lobe here. So this lateral sulcus here, if we took these little retractors and we opened it up and looked sort of deep to the lateral sulcus, or if you had your model and you kind of opened it up in lab, the insular lobe is right under there. So we have the insular lobe, it's just deep to that lateral sulcus. So that insular lobe here has to do with taste. Now this part here is the temporal lobe, right? That has to do with both hearing and smell. Your parietal lobe mostly has to do with body sensation, and then your occipital lobe has to do with vision. And we're going to kind of go through each of these as we go. And then Wernicke's area here we'll talk about when we talk a little bit about some of the more complex processing and language acquisition. So first we'll talk about motor areas. So if we say motor areas, remember that the frontal lobe deals with all the motor stuff. So this is the frontal lobe, it's kind of the front part of your brain, and it's going to be controlling your motor stuff, all of your actions, any voluntary movement that you're doing. And so we have a couple of different motor areas to learn, and these are all within the frontal lobe. The first one is called the primary motor cortex, located in the precentral gyrus. So if you remember, the precentral gyrus is this gyrus that's right in front of the central sulcus. So here's the precentral gyrus. And so this blue strip right here is the primary motor cortex. And this primary motor cortex is also called the somatic motor area. This is where we consciously control and like initiate conscious actions. And so this controls skeletal muscle activity on the opposite side of the body. So on the left, primary motor cortex is going to control the right side of the body, and the right primary motor cortex is going to control the left side of the body. As we said, these connections are almost always crossed. And so when we say they project contralaterally means the opposite side. So within the brainstem or the spinal cord. So they're going to cross. So you're going to have your nerves come from these side and they come down, and then they're going to cross, usually within the brainstem or the spinal cord. So they cross. So they're going to cross from the left side to the right, or from the right side to the left. And so each of your different areas in this primary motor cortex is going to control a different part of your body. And they've actually mapped this, and they call it the motor homunculus. And a homunculus just means something with weird, distorted proportions. And this is because areas like your hands that are very complicated. Think about playing an instrument or playing a piano or drawing. Like, you have to have a lot of nerves going to your hands because your fingers and your hands can make very complicated movements. Whereas your elbow, you really just flex and extend it. It's not as complicated. So you have a relatively greater portion of your primary motor cortex of your brain devoted to controlling your hands, because they're really important. And like your face and your tongue and everything for movements have to do with speech and breathing. All of these have a really large area of your primary motor cortex devoted to them. And so if we look here, this is kind of what it looks like. This is the drawing, where you can see like your trunk and your hip and your shoulder. They don't really need a lot of brain because you don't do quite as much with them. Whereas your face, your tongue, your throat, your hands, especially, all of these here have a large amount of brain power, like a large amount of brain devoted to helping control them, because you have so many different little specialized functions and so many different things you need to do there. So this is what our motor homunculus looks like. So it's this weird, distorted little person with distorted proportions. And so this is within that precentral gyrus. So each little piece of the frontal cortex within that precentral gyrus. So all the nerves in here control the forearm, and all the neurons in here control the eyelid and eyeball, and the neurons in here control the neck. And so they've done some studies to kind of map this, and this is a general map for that. So that was the first area, the primary motor cortex. And if we look back here, that's this guy right here. But know that we also have some other motor areas here. So we've got the premotor cortex, the frontal eye field, and the motor speech area. And so these are going to be a little bit just in front of, or more anterior to, or more rostral to the primary motor cortex. And we're going to talk about each of those as we go through. So the motor speech area it really has to do with the movements associated with speech. So the movements of your muscles associated with speech. And it controls movements for vocalization. It's located in the inferolateral portion of the left frontal lobe in most people. So as we said before, the left side of the brain is a little bit more likely to have things associated with speech in it. And so this right here is going to be the motor speech area. Now, another name for the motor speech area is Broca's area. And so you might hear that Broca's aphasia has to do with damage or problems with that Broca's area. So make sure you kind of know both of those names just in case. Next, we have the frontal eye field. Now, the frontal eye field is located in the frontal lobe, and it controls movements associated with your eyes, especially with reading and tracking things. And so, and like binocular vision, so that we have our eyes tracking together. So we have a large area of our brain just devoted for that, because we're very visual beings. And then we finally have the premotor cortex. And the premotor cortex is it's something called an association area. And so these association areas are areas that sort of coordinate or integrate things. And so this premotor cortex is going to be the area where we coordinate and we plan any of these skilled activities. And so this is located right in front of the, it says anterior to the premotor cortex. It should be anterior to the primary motor cortex right here. So it's located right in front of that primary motor cortex. So it's this guy right over here. And so if we go through here, there's a better picture here that shows all the motor and association areas. So this is going to be our primary motor cortex that directly controls those voluntary skeletal muscles. Then we have Broca's area, or the motor speech area, and this is going to regulate the skeletal movements associated with speech, right? Motor speech area. Then right down here, we have the frontal eye field, and this frontal eye field is going to have to do with moving all these little eye muscles around. We will learn all the eye muscles, but it's going to be in chapter 16. So we'll talk about those in lab. And then finally, this part up here that's kind of this red color is the premotor cortex, or the somatic motor association area. And so this is where we plan and coordinate things. And so it doesn't actually tell the skeletal muscles what to do, but it kind of plans and coordinates, and then it tells the primary motor cortex what to tell the muscles to do. And so especially involving like skilled motor activities or learned motor activities. So all of these are going to be found in the frontal lobe, because the frontal lobe has to do with motor. Now we're going to talk about the sensory areas of the rest of the brain. So remember that each of our other lobes is associated with a specific sense. And so the first one is going to be the parietal lobe. So if we keep going further back, the parietal lobe is going to be associated with, we said, somatic senses, or body senses. So the sense of touch, the sense of temperature, the sense of pain, pressure, those types of things. So the sense of touch, pressure, pain, all of that, where we have all these little receptors all over our body. That's what our parietal lobe is going to be involved with. Now, the main portion of the parietal lobe, or the very important one to know, is the primary somatosensory cortex. And this is located on the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. So if we look here, remember our primary motor cortex was in the precentral gyrus right here, and then just opposite it, right across that central sulcus, is our primary somatosensory cortex. And it also is going to be, they've studied it, and we also have a sensory homunculus associated with this. And so this is going to receive each little part of that brain in your parietal lobe, so it's right a little bit further back, is going to receive senses from a certain part of your body, right? A certain part of your skin. as we said, your parietal lobe is going to receive senses from all over the body. So we have a different area in that little postcentral gyrus, right, that primary somatosensory cortex. Each different area is going to receive sensory information from a different part of the body. And it's going to have to do with proprioception, which means where your body is located in space. It gets information about touch, about pressure, about pain, and about temperature. And so as we said before, we can make this little sensory homunculus where we have a lot of our, if you think about feeling things, you usually use your hand to feel things, not like the back of your arm, because your fingers have a lot of sensory receptors in there and they can feel things really well. And like, so people that read Braille, they read with their fingers. They're not, not like, the back of your arm or your back. And so we have a lot more of our brain devoted to our fingers and our face, because that's where we have a lot of feeling happening. And so just similar to, we do a lot of motor activities with our hands and our face. We also feel a lot of things with them. And so we have a large area of the brain devoted to sensing the hands and the face, and a relatively smaller amount of the brain devoted to sensing other things. So this is our sensory homunculus. And this is located right behind that central sulcus in that post-central gyrus that we identified in lab last week. And so if we go back here, so the first part of that is going to be the primary somatosensory cortex, but then right behind it, so just posterior to the primary somatosensory cortex in, the rest of the parietal lobe, we have something called a somatosensory association area. So anytime we talk about an association area, it works in association with a sense or with our motor component here. And so this is going to be integrating that sense. So the sense comes in, right, to the primary somatosensory cortex, and then it's going to send that information back to the association area, and that association area is going to integrate it and kind of make sense of that information. And in this case, one of the things it does is it helps us identify objects by feel, and so it's going to help us sort of integrate and make sense of that information. All right, so next we're going to move on to the visual stuff. So this is in the occipital lobe. So remember, the occipital lobe has to do with vision, and there are two main areas in there. So we have the primary visual cortex. This is where that visual information actually goes into your brain. And then a little bit in front of that, we have the visual association area. And this is going to surround the primary visual cortex. And once again, it integrates that information. It takes the visual information and is going to link it to memory to identify things we've seen. It helps us identify faces, although there's like a complicated way that we identify faces and things. It integrates color and form, so it helps us with our visual information. I just want to put a little plug in for a book that I've read recently. It's called Zombies Dream of Undead Sheep, a neuroscientific view of the zombie brain. And it's a really cool book where neuroscientists have gone through, who like zombies, and they've gone through and looked at all the zombie movies, and they've decided to try to diagnose the zombies and figure out which part of the brain must be like malfunctioning in order for the zombies to be acting the way they do. And so it's a whole thing, and it goes through a lot of different neuroscience, and it goes into more detail than we do in this class, but it's really cool. And so they use this sort of like funny, diagnosing zombies to talk about normal brain physiology and how the normal brain works and what might be broken in the zombie brain. So anyway, I read that fall semester. It was pretty good. So maybe I'll put a link somewhere. It does go into more detail than you would need to know for this class, but if you like zombies and you like neuroscience, it's a pretty good read. But they talk a little bit about how you identify faces and how people sometimes can have damage to certain parts of their brain, and it makes them not able to identify the faces of like friends and family. And there are some different disorders about that. All right, so that was a tangent, but anyway, moving on. So next we're going to move on to the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is associated with two senses. It's associated with the sense of hearing as well as the sense of smell. And so in the temporal lobe, we have a couple of things. So first we have the primary auditory cortex. And this is going to be where the sense, the information, like our hearing sensations, are going to go. And then next to that, we have the auditory association area, where we interpret the sounds that we've heard and we store and retrieve those memories of sounds. So like those songs that you get stuck in your head. important sound memories. And now finally, the other part is the sense of smell. So we have a primary olfactory cortex in the temporal lobe too. And so this provides us with a conscious awareness of smells. Now the insula, remember that deep lobe that's deep right under that lateral, the lateral sulcus, is going to have the primary gustatory cortex. So remember that gustatory means taste. So this has to do with processing taste information and then often linking it to memories too. And both of these, smell and taste, can be linked to memories pretty closely. So here we go. This is our sensor areas down here. So once again, our parietal lobe has to do with the sense of touch. So this is the primary somatosensory cortex and the somatosensory association area. So that's like body, touch, and pain and temperature. Our occipital lobe has to do with vision. So we have our primary visual cortex and the visual association area. Then our temporal lobe has to do with, this part is hearing, so our auditory, primary auditory cortex, and then auditory association area. And then in here, sort of deep, we've got the deeper areas of the temporal lobe, which is the primary olfactory cortex, and then the insula, which is the primary gustatory cortex. And so both of those are going to be a little bit deeper. And then smell and taste can often be linked to memories too. And we'll talk a little bit about memory and emotion with the limbic system. So the last thing we're going to talk a little bit about are these functional brain regions. And these functional brain regions are usually involved with higher order thinking, and they might, like Wernicke's area, it's going to be found in multiple different lobes. So the first one is the prefrontal cortex. And so they're going to integrate information from multiple different association areas. So the prefrontal cortex is going to be the very front of your brain. And this prefrontal cortex has to do with complex thought, judgment, personality, planning, all of these other like things that the frontal area has to do. Because remember, we said frontal area has to do with motor that we talked about, as well as all these like complex decision-making things. And so this prefrontal cortex is still developing through adolescence into your early 20s. So those neurons are still myelinating up into your early 20s. And so the personality is obviously developing and changing, especially through those teenage years and even into early 20s. And so all of this is going to be important with like risk-taking behaviors and decision-making and judgment. Wernicke's area, so here, the whole blue area here is that prefrontal cortex. And Wernicke's area here, this is going to be important for understanding speech and spoken and written language. And this is a little bit more likely to be on the left side of the brain because remember, the left side of the brain has more to do with speech. Just like our Broca's area was more likely on the left side. But this is going to be important because we kind of take information from multiple different association areas and we're going to understand either the listening to speech or we're going to be reading speech. So some from the visual association, I guess Braille probably would have a little bit to do with that too if you were feeling different symbols on the Braille. But this is going to help us understand spoken and written language. So that was all the cortex. And so the cortex is the outer layer of our cerebrum. And the cortex is going to be involved as that outer layer of gray matter, right? So that's where we have lots of cell bodies, lots of dendrites, some unmyelinated axons. So that's all on the outside. And because the cell bodies and things are located there, a lot of our processing is going to happen there. But we also, right under the cortex, we have white matter. And so white matter is going to be located just deep to that gray cerebral cortex. And these white matter is going to be made up of myelinated axons. And these axons are going to connect all those gray matter areas to each other, right? Because if they didn't have connections, then all of the brain would just, each neuron wouldn't be able to talk to any other neuron, and it would be very hard to integrate that information. So we need these connections. And as these connections, we have a lot of axons that run together. In the peripheral nervous system, we would call it a nerve, and it would be wrapped up in those layers of connective tissue. But in the central nervous system, it doesn't need that extra protection. We call this a tract. A tract is where we have a bunch of axons kind of moving together in a common area. And so these tracts are going to be a bunch of axons moving together in the central nervous system. And we have different types of tracts depending on where they're going and what parts they're connecting. And so association tracts are the first ones. these are going to connect regions of the cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. So either all the left hemisphere or all the right hemisphere. So first we have arcuate fibers. These are going to be short little tracts that connect neighboring gyri. And so these little guys right here are going to be, they connect one gyrus to the next, usually within the same lobe or within a lobe right next to each other. Next, we have longitudinal fasciculi. These are longer tracts that connect gyri in different lobes. And so if we look here, you can see these longitudinal fasciculi might go from one lobe to the other, and they're a lot longer. Because we need to have different areas of our brain communicating with each other for us to integrate all that information. The next type of tract we have is going to be these guys right here. And these are going to be called commissural tracts. These are going to connect regions in different hemispheres. So they're going to connect the right and the left hemisphere together. So the biggest one that we've talked about and we've already known is the corpus callosum, right? The corpus callosum is that really big one, and it is going to be connecting the right and left hemisphere together. But we also have the anterior and posterior commissure. And so in this picture, we can see a little bit of the anterior commissure. So they're connecting one hemisphere to the other. And so that way we have a lot of information being sent from one side of the brain to the next. Then finally, we have projection tracts, and these are the last tracts, and they're going to go from the brain down to inferior brain regions like the spinal cord or the brainstem, and then the spinal cord. And so, for example, we have something called a corticospinal tract, and they carry signals from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. And so these guys right here, these green ones, are going to be called those projection tracts. And this is another view of the corpus callosum and how it connects the left and right hemispheres, this commissural tract. So right here, and as these guys course right through here, between the cerebral nuclei and the thalamus over here, it's called the internal capsule. So just if you hear the internal capsule, it's just going to be these projection tracts down here. Now notice that usually these tracts are going to cross. Remember, we said that the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body and so on. And so most of them are going to cross. And so the medulla oblongata has something called, it has two little pyramids running down the front. And these pyramids are where we have a lot of these, especially motor tracts. But the decussation in the pyramids here is going to be the area where these tracts are crossing. And so usually we have this crossing happen so that the left side of the brain is going to cross over and control the right side of the body and vice versa. So remember we said that we have two hemispheres, the right and the left, and we just looked at how they are connected to each other and to the rest of the body. And the right and the left actually have slightly different jobs, right? They're a little bit specialized, but they still obviously are, you need both, and they talk to each other a lot, but they have a little bit slightly different jobs and they're specialized. And so we call this cerebral lateralization, right? So they're different specialized jobs. Now, usually you have two different hemispheres. One of them is specialized for categorical thinking. And so categorical thinking has to do with like math and language and categorization and analysis. And it contains the Wernicke's area and the motor speech area. And in most people, it's the left hemisphere is the categorical. So it has language, math, things like that. Whereas the right or the other hemisphere is the representational hemisphere. And this has to do with visuospatial relationships, imagination, comparison of the senses, things like that. And this is usually the right hemisphere. So it's a little bit more often the right hemisphere. So the two hemispheres obviously are very, they communicate all the time through the corpus callosum. You need both. We need information from both to integrate together. But they just kind of specialize a little bit. So each one is a little bit better at doing something. So this example, this picture right here, I'll go back to that slide before, it's kind of showing us a little bit about how the different hemispheres are specialized. So in this example, the categorical hemisphere is shown on the left side because that's more common. And so things like the motor speech area or Broca's area is usually on the left side. The Wernicke's area, which has to do with language and math comprehension, is usually on the left side. And as well as if we look at, remember that the left side of the brain is going to control the right hand, as well as feel things from the right side of the body. And then if we look, we'll talk a little bit more about the eyes and how the eye fields work, but the way that our eyes are, some of the axons cross and some don't. So we see sort of like the left side of the brain is going to see like the right side of each eye, what the right portion of what each eye sees. And then the right side of the brain is going to see kind of like the left side of what each eye sees. As well as the right side of the brain is going to control the left hand, and it's going to receive senses from the left side of the body. Now, other things that this representational hemisphere does, which is more often the right, is going to be things like memories for shapes, feeling shapes, visuospatial and artistic things, musical ability, recognition of faces, and spatial relationships. So they work together, but each hemisphere is just a little bit specialized. So they're a little bit better at doing one or the other. So this lateralization, you can see it developing really early in childhood, before 5 or 6 years of age. Like my toddlers are both very obviously right-handed. Lateralization differs between the sexes. Women have a thicker posterior corpus callosum, and so there's a little bit more connections between them. And so if women do have damage to one hemisphere, they have a little bit more ability to sort of compensate for it. So men suffer a little bit more functional loss. Lateralization is often correlated with handedness. So in right-handed people, the left hemisphere is almost always categorical and speech dominant, whereas left-handed individuals can have either. So if you are left-handed, you might have your categorical hemisphere might be on the left or it might be on the right. But either way, in general, so it's a little bit more common to have people who are right-handed, and the left hemisphere is usually the categorical hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is usually representational. So now I want to move a little bit deeper. So we've talked about the cerebral cortex and how it's connected and how each of your little areas are connected together. I want to briefly mention something called the cerebral nuclei. And these are a nucleus or nuclei are a collection of cell bodies in the CNS. And this is going to be gray matter that's deep in the cerebrum. And they are going to generally, so it's these guys right here. So we've got the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, the amygdaloid body. The only one I really want you guys to focus mostly on is the amygdaloid body. These do a lot of really important things. They help us regulate our motor output. They help regulate things, but we don't have enough time in this class to really dive deep into what they do. So I'm just going to kind of do a brief overview. So because they help regulate that motor output, diseases of these nuclei are often associated with involuntary movements. The amygdaloid body is the main one to know, or the amygdala, and it functions in mood and emotions. So when we talk about mood and emotions and memory, we'll talk about the amygdala. So that's one of the reasons to know that and remember that. So the amygdala right down here. All right, so you guys can go through and practice answering some of these questions. The 5 lobes and the main function, the function of the corpus callosum, the general functions of the cerebrum. Make sure you know where each of the motor areas is located and what it does. What's the general purpose of those association areas? Remember we said like integration and coordination and planning. What parts of the brain are linked by each different types of tracts? We went over that. What are the primary functions of the left cerebral hemisphere versus the right cerebral hemisphere, assuming that the left is categorical and the right is representational. And then a little bit about the general function of the cerebral nuclei. But remember, we only went over a tiny bit about those. So now we're going to move on to some of our higher order brain functions. And so I'm going to talk about the higher order brain functions that are mostly found within the cerebral cortex, although some of these also involve some of the deeper structures that we'll talk about on Friday. So these higher order mental functions include learning, memory, and reasoning. They occur within the cortex of the cerebrum, so which we just talked about, right? The frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, temporal lobe, the insula. They usually involve multiple brain regions. So remember, all of these brain regions, they have their own specific functions, but they talk together and they communicate together. And so all of these brain regions work together to form these higher order functions. And we have both conscious and unconscious processing involved. So you can consciously think about something, but we also have kind of the unconscious processing that happens. So I want to briefly talk about development and how the CNS develops. So remember that if you ever think about or have seen a baby and a toddler develop, they are going to, their processing abilities, their cognition obviously becomes more advanced as they get older. Most of the axons in the CNS are still myelinating during the first 2 years of life. And so that means those little myelin sheaths are still, covering up all those areas of the axon, and the action potentials aren't going through as quickly, and their brain is growing at an astounding rate in the first 5 years. And so about 95% is complete at age 5, but even after that, they still have some more brain growth. At this time, like, we start where our brain is growing at an amazing rate, and we have lots and lots of new connections being made. And then after early childhood, the processing gets a little bit more complex. So new connections are still being made, but others are pruned. So anything that we do a lot of and that we continue to reinforce will have new connections there. But if you stop doing something or stop learning something, then some of those connections may be pruned to make room for more new connections. So myelination does not totally complete during the first, in early childhood. It's still going on, and especially in that prefrontal cortex. So remember, this area where that has to do with personality, decision-making, free will, it is really still under construction for a long time. And these are still undergoing myelination in adolescence up until the early 20s. And so obviously we're going to have a lot of, personality is being shaped during the teenage years. And we have a lot of things that are still happening. Axons of the peripheral nervous system are going to continue to myelinate past puberty also, but they're not going to be as important in like shaping personality as that prefrontal cortex. So this is kind of just a brief interlude now. Some of the ways that we study how the brain works is going to be, one of the ways is called an EEG, or an electroencephalogram. And that's where we can attach electrodes to the head to record brain activity. So this is one of the ways we've studied some of the brains and figured out what happens in different areas. This can be used in sleep studies, studies of people with brain lesions, which is a problem in a part of the brain, if they're in a coma or a vegetative state. It can be used to evaluate epilepsy or repeated seizures. And it's going to basically receive brain waves, the different types of brain waves. And so alpha and beta waves are going to be different frequencies are designated by Greek letters. Alpha and beta waves are more common in wakefulness, whereas delta and theta waves are more common in sleep. And so they can actually take these electrodes and put them on the patient's head and then examine the location of different types of brain activity. And so this is kind of an example of this. And so awake with mental activity is going to be beta waves. Awake and resting are those alpha waves. Sleeping are those theta waves. And then really deep sleep is delta waves. And so we can kind of record what's happening in the brain and see a little bit about how active the brain is. And I'm mentioning this because we're going to talk a little bit about sleep now. And we'll talk about different stages of sleep have different types of patterns of brain waves. So sleep is natural. It's a temporary absence of consciousness. And it's kind of amazing that you can fall asleep and you're not really conscious anymore. And then in the morning you wake up and you become conscious again. It's kind of really interesting. During sleep, you have less activity in the cerebral cortex, less conscious activity. But we have our brain stem and our diencephalon and all of those important things that keep our body working. Our homeostatic mechanisms are going to go. They are maintained so that, we're still alive, we're still breathing, our heart's still beating, our blood pressure is maintained. But it's going to be mostly the cerebral cortex that's going to be quieting. We have different stages of sleep, and we're going to go through a predictable routine, I guess, of predictable stages of sleep. And they're characterized by different EEG frequencies, so different waves, as well as if sometimes our eyes move and sometimes they don't. So non-REM sleep. So REM means rapid eye movement. So non-REM means stages of sleep where your eyes don't really move around much. At that point, we have slower frequency brain waves. This is like most of our sleep time, about 75%. this type of sleep is going to be important for rest, growth, energy conservation, and strength renewal. Another thing we'll talk about in the endocrine chapter in 169 is that a lot of our hormones, when they're more often, their release is based on the circadian rhythm. And so a lot of times they're a lot like our growth hormone is released at night when you're sleeping. And so a lot of growth is going to happen at night when you're sleeping. So that's interesting. And so this non-REM sleep is divided into substages that we'll talk about with different frequencies. REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, your brain is active and your eyes are moving all around. And this is usually that dreaming sleep, that you can remember those dreams. It's only about 25% of total sleep time. And we think that it's important for consolidating memories, keeping memories that are important, getting rid of memories that aren't. But it's a little bit hard to study, and we're still doing lots of studies on it. So here's a hypnogram, which is like basically looking at the different stages of sleep and when they happen. And so usually you have this kind of predictable, you go through these different stages, you go back to rapid eye, you might awaken brief, you go through the stages, come back to REM, you might awaken briefly. And this is really common. And like, especially in babies and young children, if they wake up and they can't get back to sleep, that's when, you know, you'll hear them crying in the middle of the night because like lost their pacifier, or they, you know, they realize they're alone. Usually when adults will have these brief awakenings, but they don't really even remember them because they can go right back to sleep. And so you've got the rapid eye movement sleep here is going to have the faster eye movements, and it has a little bit, the brain is more active, whereas the non-REM sleep, we have slower frequency brain waves, the brain is more quiet, and you get more rest during those times. So they're deep sleep. So we have the different stages. I'm not going to ask you too many questions about sleep, so you don't have to memorize necessarily these different orders. But in general, sleep is really important. So I do want you to know it's important. You need to like get good sleep before an exam. Sleep helps consolidate memories. It helps with learning. But the amount of sleep you need changes on the lifetime and based on your age. So infants need 17 to 18 hours at least. Newborns probably need even more. They sleep a lot. Teens need 8.5 to 9.5 hours. Adults 7 to 8 hours. And then like if you put like preschoolers and things in there, they're going to need, you know, 14 to 16 hours. It kind of goes through. If we don't get enough sleep, it's unhealthy. It actually is associated with depression, poor memory, and poor immune function. So try to make sure you get enough sleep. It will help. I know sometimes it's hard. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and they both wake up still, especially newborns. It's hard to get a lot of sleep, but it is definitely adults and children who don't get enough sleep are more cranky and not as tolerant and have poor memories, and it can be associated with poor mood and depression too. Insomnia is the difficulty in falling asleep or staying asleep, and it's really common, and it gets a little bit more common as we age. Sleep apnea is another problem of sleep, and this is when your breathing is interrupted during sleep. And so you can either have central or peripheral. Like the most common is obstructive sleep apnea. So like you're sleeping, and then for some reason, like the soft tissues of your mouth get really tired and they kind of sag. And so when you're breathing, you know, it might obstruct the entrance of air. So you might not be able to get enough air in. And so you might hear people breathe a little bit and then stop breathing for a little while and then take this like really big breath, and they might snore loudly. And this has actually been associated with sleep apnea can be associated with like increase in cardiac problems and some other problems too. So it's definitely important to identify and treat sleep apnea early so that we don't have other problems. With the sleep apnea, if you don't breathe a lot, you can actually see the oxygen saturation go down a little bit during sleep apnea. It can be treated with something called a CPAP, or a continuous positive airway pressure mask, if it's serious enough to need that. All right, so moving from sleep, I want to talk about cognition or consciousness, the mental processes of awareness, knowledge, memory, perception, and thinking. So there's lots of things involved in cognition. We're doing them right now all the time, right? We're learning, we're thinking, we're critically understanding things. And the association areas of the cerebrum are responsible, right? We said the parts that they're taking that sensory information, and they're taking it and they're integrating it, and then they talk with each other too. So they're going to integrate together. Now, it's been hard to figure out exactly which part of the brain does what, and we're still doing a lot of research on that. But one of the ways that they have historically studied this is to look at patients with naturally occurring brain lesions or problems with the brain. And in one of the ed puzzles, it'll talk about Phineas Gage, who's someone who had a frontal lobe lesion and kind of like he had personality changes as kind of an example. But they are going to, you can look at the patient, and if you know where the problem is, say, well, there's a problem with the temporal lobe and the patient has problems hearing, you can kind of correlate that, well, maybe the temporal lobe has something to do with hearing. And you can see that damage to the primary somatosensory cortex, right, which would be in the parietal lobe, is going to cause loss of body awareness on the opposite side of the body. So you can figure out, oh, well, that's how they figured out that the left side of the body, the left side of the brain senses things from the right side of the body, because patients with damage to the left primary somatosensory cortex couldn't feel parts of the right side of their body. So that's kind of one of the ways it can be studied. Agnosia is the inability to recognize or understand the meaning of stimuli. And this usually has to do with having a lesion in an association area associated with that sense. And so the location of the lesion would determine the nature of the loss. And that means if the lesion was in the temporal lobe, it might make it so that you couldn't recognize the meaning of sounds or words, right? Because the temporal lobe has to do with auditory. If the lesion was in the occipital lobe, it might mean that you wouldn't be able to understand the meaning of things that you see, like visual information. So language is going to be a big part of cognition and higher order mental processes. And language is going to be mostly found, as we said, in different areas in the cerebral cortex. It involves reading, understanding, speaking, and writing words. So we've got a bunch of different things to work together. So we've already talked about the motor speech area, or Broca's area, and Wernicke's area. And both of these areas are going to be important for language comprehension as well as language creation. So Wernicke's area interprets the language, so either written or spoken, whereas the motor speech area, or Broca's area, is going to sort of plan how to make language, how to speak. And this primary motor cortex here is going to signal the motor neurons to produce speech. And then obviously the prefrontal cortex is important with like understanding speech as well as deciding what to say. So the prefrontal cortex is pretty important in most of our planning, decision making, any type of higher order mental function. And so remember, we talked about the different sides being a little bit lateralized. So the categorical hemisphere, which is usually the left side and usually has Wernicke's area in it, is going to analyze the literal meaning of speech, right? So this is like, what do the words themselves actually mean? What are they saying? So like if you're reading a text message, what are the words meaning? Whereas the representational hemisphere, which is usually the right side, an area just on the opposite of that, is going to be analyzing the emotional content of the speech. So listening to the tone of voice. Is the person angry? Are they sad? Are they, understanding what the other person is saying, and if they are, what emotion they're conveying with their words. We also have the, it can also be important in imparting emotion into your own words, making your words seem dull. If you have a lesion in the right hemisphere, it's called right hemisphere disorder. Opposite to Wernicke's area, it can cause dull or emotionless sleep because that part of your brain is not able to impart emotion into your speech. Some other types of motor problems. Apraxia of speech is just a motor disorder where the person's aware of what they want to say, but they can't actually get it to come out or speak properly. Whereas aphasia can be a little bit more, it's difficulty in either understanding or producing speech. So these people may produce comprehensible speech, but they may not produce comprehensible speech. But they might not realize it. So they think that they're saying something, to them, it sounds like they're saying something normal, but no one else can understand it. And this can happen due to a head injury or a stroke. So these different types of aphasia and apraxia of speech, the different disorders, I probably won't test you on too much, but definitely understand that Wernicke's area, Broca's area, the primary motor cortex, all of those are important for initiating speech, and that we have some lateralization to speech, whereas the left hemisphere is going to be more associating with the meaning with the words, and the right hemisphere has to do with the motion attached to those words. And so the last thing we'll mention is dyslexia. And dyslexia has to do a little bit with words and sometimes numbers, has to do with single word decoding. So individuals with it usually have trouble reading, writing, and spelling. Usually, or it can have some improvement with time. They think that I guess some research shows that it may have to do with a disconnect syndrome and impaired transfer of information through the corpus callosum. But I'm not going to ask too much about dyslexia either.